So there's a couple of things to unpack with this one. For starters, it doesn't matter that it's summer. Everyone's going to keep their windows rolled up for the entirety of it. Two, my apologies to Chris Tomlin, because you can in fact binge his music, especially Good Good Father, when you're trying to get rid of the demons that you just conjured up when you watched this movie. And three, it doesn't matter how bad your family is. There is no way that your family is as bad as the family in this movie, which means your stuff can be fixed. Now, I know some of you are a little too scared to watch this movie, which is why I have the Let Me Explain. I explain it to you in 5 minutes. Super simple. Definitely go check out that channel. He's a good guy over there. But here, I like breaking down the movie for not only its mythology, little things that you probably missed, but my favorite part, which is the actual metaphors, the messaging, what I personally learned from it. Now, this entire movie is just a generations-long ritual. The entire movie is about a sacrifice that's happening. We're just seeing it from the perspective of those who are getting sacrificed. Now, the theory is that it may all be in their heads, like the movie's talking about. The metaphors, which we'll get to, is all about mental disorders and how that's what's being passed down through the generations. But I want to look at it first and foremost as a horror movie. As a horror movie, what we're really looking at is a grandma who's running a cult. This grandma and her cult who is worshiping this deity right here that reminded me of that one Digimon named Piedmon.
He's a mega phantom Digimon of the worst kind. You never know what he's going to look like next.
Her and her crew's main goal is to get this demon a male body, and this entire movie is the grandma's plan on trying to get that. There's even a point after the grandma's death, which is a part of the plan, that the mom finds a note that says, "Our sacrifice will pale in the rewards." Don't ever complain when your grandma gets you an ugly sweater. There's a bunch of little details that not only adds to the mythology of the deity and the grandma's family, but a lot of little Easter eggs throughout that show you that, again, this entire movie was orchestrated by the grandma and this cult. For example, you got this symbol. At first I thought it was like the grandma who went to like, I don't know, Jared's and decided, hey, you know, this is gonna be the family No. In real life, not the movie, this is the actual symbol for this demon that people actually worship in real life. Once you know that, you start noticing that it's everywhere. It's on the strangers at the funeral who are a part of the cult. The first time you see Joanne, she's actually wearing the emblem as a ring. It's embroidered in places everywhere. And the one time that it actually blew me away the most, it was the second time I caught the movie. And I noticed it on the freaking pole before Charlie's accident. That's when you start realizing that this cult really is orchestrating everything, including that accident. That nothing actually is an accident. They're just ahead of everything. For those who care to know more about this Digivillain, know that there are links online, but the director also did say that he took a lot of liberties, right? So while it is based off of an actual demon and some of the symbols, not everything transfers over. We do know that he's got a little Loki in him, since he is considered the god of mischief. He's one of the 8 guardians, not of the galaxy, but of hell. And again, the main goal of this cult is to help this thing get a male body that it can transfer to. If you've seen Paranormal Activity, you know what it is. These demons want one thing, and it's disgusting. Now, when you watch the movie a second time, you start realizing how they actually orchestrate this plan, and it's obviously all manipulation, right? You got Joanne. Never trust Joanne. You got Joanne going to, like, the Joanne Fabrics place where Annie's getting her artwork. That's not a coincidence. Her being at the therapy sessions, not a coincidence. Her making up the story, may be true, but I consider it making up the story because she knew that would be something that resonates with Annie. No, it's all manipulation, and in fact, my buddy Chase from A Few Mixed Reviews brings up a good point with it.
But when she's calling out to her grandson, she calls it Louis, which is, you know, short for Lucifer. So right there, I was like, haha, and I'm like standing up like, yo, that's dope, and like no one else really got it. So I was like, all right, I guess this movie's just made for me. But if you got that reference, then you're a true one.
It's a bad year if your name is Louis, but what's super interesting about this cult manipulating other people in this way is that when a cult does it, it's terrible. Churches do this all the time. I know this. Trust, I know this 100%. There's a scene in the movie where she drops off, or one of the cult members drops off a little seance, like little postcard. In Christianity, those are called tracts, and the whole point of it is that you're subliminally kind of implanting that thought. Whether you just pick it up and dismiss it, you've read it, it's already in your subconscious. That idea is seen throughout the movie when we keep seeing the words for that exact seance being carved into the walls of the house. It's subliminally being implemented into our minds. And there's even a point where there's a phrase that's Baruch atah Yahweh, which I'm very familiar with. It is a Jewish saying that means blessed be to Yahweh. Knowing that Ari Aster is Jewish, and maybe I just heard this, but this dude found a way to take that and flip Yahweh with the demon's name? Now let me cut to the chase and get to the theory about the heads that get cut, which when you first see the pigeon getting sliced, you may think, oh, it's just a one-off thing, or maybe it may be a theme. And by the time that you notice that the kids upstairs at the party are watching black and white guillotine videos, you now have my attention. This would be part of the added mythology that Aster implements, because at a certain point when they're looking at a spirit book, it shows this specific demon holding 3 heads, which, you know, it eventually gets. In my theory, the whole point of the decapitations is part of this thing's ritual, right? Like, the only way that it can transfer to bodies until it gets to Peter's, the ones that it actually wants, because that's the male in this family lineage, it needs to kind of like decapitate the heads in order for it to be released. Like, you have the grandma, right? Let's say it starts off in the grandma's. The grandma then gets like taken out from her grave and they chop off her head. Now it's free to go to the next person, which is Charlie. Then what happens with Charlie, as we see as the whole thing is orchestrated, be it by coincidence almost, and everything needs to be detailed, but they find a way to decapitate her head, which then causes it to go to Annie. And then once Annie has it, eventually you see her like freaking Colgate floss her head off. Then they're able to get to Peter. I know that there's a theory out there about Charlie being possessed since she was born, because, you know, there's a little miniature that shows the grandma even breastfeeding Charlie. You know, she mentions how grandma wanted her to be a boy, the way that she even acts, because let's be honest, there are points where she really is eating peanut M&Ms like right here, even though she has an allergy. Even the movie ends with Joanne calling Peter Charlie, so I mean, I know there's an added factor to that, and that can stand, but to me, the whole implementing of the cut off heads being a part of this mythology goes hand in hand with the vulnerability that these characters need to be in, right? It's mentioned at one point that the father, the grandpa, actually starved himself to death. They even mentioned that the grandma did have the perfect option at first because she had a son, but that son, as she claimed, got a bunch of voices put into his mind because of his mother, and then he committed suicide, and thus it then goes to the next people. So that whole point of vulnerability means that the grandma was so attached to the daughter, Charlie.
I didn't let her anywhere near me when I had my son, which is why I gave her my daughter, who she immediately stabbed her hooks into.
And not only was she named after her Uncle Charles, but the fact that she was so close to the grandma knew that the moment that she goes, the moment the grandma dies, that puts her in a vulnerable state. Once she's vulnerable, she can get possessed. Her death will get Annie in a vulnerable state. And then what ends up getting Peter at a vulnerable state is the fact that he goes through what he sees in the third act. I think this theory holds up since there's a lot of shots like this that happen after very climactic scenes when a character has gone through something that shows you that the perspective has been flipped. But there's even literal lines where the character that Ann Dowd plays even stands outside of school and yells at Peter to get expelled from his own body. Like, usually you have someone trying to exorcise demons out of a body. This woman is telling Peter to leave his own body. That's like someone trying to kick you out of your own house. You then notice the obsession with birds in the movie, which to me is part of, again, the deity's mythology. There's birds in the room. You could say that Charlie sleeps in what looks like a bird house. She draws a king bird. And in Joanne's house, the symbol is kept in a bird house clocky thingy in the background. There's then the creepy dolls that Charlie makes that at first seems like a cute representation of her artsy side, something that may have been passed down because her mother is also very artsy with her miniatures. Until you notice that Joanne has them in her house and they're being used for the seance like voodoo dolls. A24 also literally sent these out as part of their marketing thing, and I'm just, no, don't do this. But this shot right here does foreshadow the ending. It shows you what was actually going to happen, and honestly, it's the most PG version of the scene that I can show without my video getting blocked.
The way I was describing it was as a family tragedy that curdles into a nightmare, in the same way that life can feel like a nightmare when disaster strikes. And so that's what the movie aims to be.
And here's where I talk about what I got out of it. I think horror films recently have really focused in on the idea of family-centric horror. You know, you got The Witch, which is about a family that falls apart after outside forces, and even the father's own structure causes them to collapse. It Comes at Night plays on the fears that a paranoid parent can have on you as they kind of over-shelter you. The Babadook reminds you to never have a child, and this one is very heavy on trauma and grief. The movie even starts with an obituary. And this has always been my favorite part of the video because, you know, the mythology is cool, and it's really cool to notice the little things in there that connect the whole plot together, but I've always been more interested in what you can get out of a movie, what you see, what impacts you. And there's definitely a lot to get out of this one, even if it just scares you, right? I know that some people can go in it and then see this as an excuse for why they should never visit their mother-in-law again, why you should never bring a sibling to a party, learn to never marry a witch. But the beauty of it is that people are going to get different things. And I love that this movie, as the director has said, is a family drama that slowly becomes a horror. And thus you can see that, well, yeah, it's demons for this story. Everybody else has different demons that get passed down. Different things that kind of like corrupt their family. Different things that you wish you can just cut off. And as the actors and filmmakers themselves have said, it's kind of therapeutic to make a movie like this.
Therapeutic is kind of an amazing, perfect word, because when else do you get to scream at your mother repeatedly? I feel like just because something is personal doesn't mean it has to be autobiographical. I think it's emotionally very personal to everybody, and I think even if they don't want to admit it, nobody knows how to deal with grief. Nobody knows how to deal with trauma. Nobody really has the perfect family dynamic, and I feel like this family is doing the best they can under the circumstances of being cursed.
To me, one of the biggest metaphors in the film were these miniatures right here. Not only does the mom use it for work, but throughout she's retelling her story through them. It's her way of coping with the trauma. She copes through her art. And what's interesting to me is that the movie itself starts out with this shot right here in the intro where it's taking place in a home, and yet it zooms into one of the miniatures, and that's where the movie is taking place. You can kind of see that as through the mother's perspective, like it's a story that's being told to express those themes of trauma and grief that they talk about. But what's really interesting about the miniatures is that the house that they shot in is literally just a giant miniature. Oxymoron, I know, but this house was literally built and designed for this movie, and when you look at it, it kind of just looks like a bigger version of the models that Annie makes in the film. Now, I'm not saying that Ari Aster's family, dealt with demons and stuff. I'm also saying they didn't. I don't know the man. But what I'm saying is that it's an interesting viewpoint, that's what movies are. There's a point in the film where Annie is like, she's making the miniature for the accident, and the husband comes in and he thinks that's completely crazy, but she tells him, no, that's just a neutral view of what happened. The best movies are when they're a neutral view of an event or a specific emotion they're trying to evoke. My conspiracy-looking self then started looking at this light and kind of saw it like the Lego movie, where it was really just her magnifying glass when she's making the miniatures that may have been reflected upon it. Even the trees in the film, when you look at it, right? I'm a big cinematography nerd, and you kind of wonder, how are these trees lit if, you walk outside, the trees that aren't even half the size of this, you won't be able to see the tops of them. It's almost like it's a giant model. But what really solidified for me the idea that this movie was meant to be therapeutic is that every time she goes to therapy, every time she comes home from it, she always lies and tells her husband that she just went to the movies. And while that may have been an excuse in the film, personally, I literally do use movies as therapy.
But I feel like there is this trend among domestic tragedies and domestic dramas, especially in the States, in America, where, people suffer a loss and then, their lives are thrown into crisis and things get very tumultuous for a while and things get very hairy, but then ultimately, their bonds are strengthened and everybody's going to be okay. I guess, I wanted to make a film where, well, it doesn't always happen that way, some people are taken down and some people don't recover. And I wanted to make a film about that, but what can be a deterrent in one genre, if it's too bleak, too hopeless, too dark, suddenly becomes a virtue in another. And the horror genre is really good for that.
If you haven't seen Ari Aster short films, I highly recommend them because they do a great job of subverting expectations, even if some people just see them as shock value. In The Strange Thing About the Johnsons, he covers family abuse, something terrible that many movies get awards for, except in this case, it wasn't a grown male with a young female. It was the son raping the father. Something that isn't even considered a taboo because it's way too out there. Another one is the short film Munchausen, which feels like a live-action version of Up meets Toy Story, where the mother loves her child so much she would do anything to keep him close. Hereditary is scary, no doubt about that. But it's also fully about trauma to me. I definitely think that you can view the entire movie as a metaphor for mental illness. It's mentioned earlier on when she mentions that her brother had voices inside of his head. And you look at that and you kind of see, I'm aware of it, how it can be passed down, in a sense, these disorders. And even back in the day when you realize that they saw, mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar as being not even something scientific, but demon possessions. It kind of is a metaphor in this movie where you actually have demon possessions. That idea that when people tell you that when you have a disorder like this, you're losing your mind, and then Ari Aster decides to go, all right, I will literally cut off their heads to represent that. You know, you kind of start seeing the parallels there. There's even that point, you know, when you're dealing with PTSD, when you're dealing with trauma, with grief, where it completely changes a person. If it hasn't happened to you, hopefully you don't know someone like that either, but there is a point where you just completely become a new person. You become possessed. Like the ending of this movie, you almost let those demons completely come over you.
I wouldn't like advocate for people doing this, but Alex seemed to have PTSD for the film. Like I don't know what he did in preparation for it, but he really it was in his chemistry what he was doing.
Now there's two final things that I want to bring up. One of them is a certain scene that happens in a classroom when they're talking about Sophocles, and he has this play where they're kind of debating whether the characters even have a choice. There's a character who even mentions how it just seems like everyone is a hopeless pawn in this hopeless machine, kind of talking about the characters in this movie. But there's even another scene where the classroom setting says that punishment brings wisdom. There's the dinner scene where she kind of almost breaks the fourth wall, where everyone's very much aware that in all the other movies, especially like family dramas, Christian films, when a tragedy happens, everything goes crazy, but they all come back together at the end stronger than they've ever been. And she even says, we could have grown from this. They could have been closer than ever before, but no one admits to what they've done. And for those who have played the game What Remains of Edith Finch, I think it's a fantastic game. Definitely go check it out. I almost see it like a spiritual... It's a game, so I would call it like an adaptation of this movie. They go hand in hand. Not only did I maybe seeing things, but saw what seemed to be like the house that's in Edith Finch in one of the miniatures. But it's that idea that the game carries with it, that the movie does well, about these curses that get passed down through generations. And that's probably the biggest impact of the movie. Knowing that it may not be easy for every family, for every household to be able to break those things, but as Annie and Kanye West say, admitting is the first step. Communication is the first step. And sadly, every family's going to have those bad apples. And even worse is that sometimes you need to learn to cut off those branches if you can. And even if your family is good, sometimes you're put in a scenario where you just have to be careful who you associate with. And never marry a witch, because that crap is hereditary. Thank you guys for checking out this video. As always, big shout out to the patrons. Appreciate their support, always helping out. But thank you to you guys who comment, like, subscribe, and especially share these videos. I'm curious to know your theories on this. Definitely don't just listen to me. There's a bunch of other great theories out there, a bunch of other, listen to the interviews. It's a very intriguing movie. I have been talking about this movie to death since Sundance, and now that it's out, I'm curious to see what you guys got out of it. So we can definitely discuss it down below. Let me know your thoughts. Like I said, I got the Let Me Explain. We definitely have more discussions down below on any other questions that you have. And yeah,